The Atlantic slave trade did not begin with a single ship, a single king, or a single law. It did not arrive all at once as a finished machine. It was assembled, tested, hardened, and expanded across centuries until it became one of the largest systems of forced movement and human exploitation in history. By the time it reached its full scale, millions of people had been stolen from Africa, marched to the coast, sold in ports and forts, packed into ships, carried across the Atlantic, and forced into labor regimes that produced immense wealth for empires, merchants, planters, financiers, insurers, manufacturers, and states. The system connected African war, European credit, American plantation labor, Atlantic shipping, and consumer appetites in one brutal circuit. To understand it, we have to resist a comforting simplification. This is not only a story about cruelty at sea. It is a story about how a commercial civilization learned to organize cruelty as routine. That is why the right question is not simply how many people were taken, though the number itself is staggering. Historians generally estimate that between 10 and 12 million Africans survived the Atlantic crossing, while many more died before embarkation, during capture, in inland transit, in coastal holding places, or at sea. The Smithsonian notes that more than 10 million Africans were forcibly imported through the transatlantic slave trade between the 17th and early 19th centuries, and that the majority were taken not to what became the United States, but to the Caribbean and South America. The larger Atlantic world mattered more than any national memory that later tried to shrink the story. The trade was not peripheral to modern history. It helped build it. The title of this documentary matters. How the system worked. Not because mechanisms matter more than people, but because the system's greatest horror lay partly in how efficiently so many different institutions learned to depend on it. Capture, sale, storage, shipment, insurance, legal registration, labor allocation, plantation accounting, and commodity export were all linked. The trade was not random violence. It was organized violence with ledgers. It was not merely greed on a dock. It was a transoceanic structure in which banks, investors, monarchies, colonial administrations, shipyards, merchants, and consumers all had reasons to avert their eyes from the human core of what enriched them. It is also important to begin with a historical correction. Slavery existed in many parts of the world long before the Atlantic system. Captivity, bondage, and the trade in enslaved people have ancient histories across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But the Atlantic slave trade created something distinct in scale, duration, racial ideology, and economic integration. It fused forced labor to plantation capitalism and imperial expansion in a way that transformed global history. It did not merely use slavery. It reorganized whole societies around it. The result was a system in which blackness became increasingly identified with inheritable enslavement, whiteness with freedom or mastery, and the labor of millions became a foundation of Atlantic wealth. That racialization did not arrive fully formed on day one. It hardened over time. Early Atlantic labor systems included indentured servants, convicts, coerced indigenous labor, and other forms of unfree work. But plantation economies in the Americas, especially sugar economies, generated an enormous appetite for labor under conditions so deadly that planters and investors continually sought new supplies of people. As those systems expanded, African slavery became not incidental but structural. Law, religion, commerce, and pseudoscience were all used to justify and naturalize a hierarchy that had been built for profit. The system worked not only because people were brutal. It worked because brutality was made ordinary, documentable, taxable, and defensible. We should also say clearly that the Atlantic slave trade was never simply a bilateral story of Europe taking from Africa. African societies were not passive landscapes waiting to be entered. They were politically complex, commercially active, militarily capable, and internally divided. European traders on the coast rarely marched inland at will to capture large numbers of people themselves. They relied on African intermediaries, alliances, wars, and existing commercial and political networks. Some African rulers and merchants profited from selling captives. Others resisted, maneuvered, or were destroyed by the violence the trade intensified. The involvement of African actors does not dilute European responsibility. It reveals the scale of the system's entanglement. Atlantic slavery expanded because many groups found ways to profit from stages of it, even while the ultimate beneficiaries were often imperial and colonial societies built on plantation export. Before the Atlantic trade reached its mature form, European powers had already been experimenting with conquest, island colonization, and plantation production. The Portuguese pushed down the West African coast in the 15th century, establishing trading contacts, seizing captives in some early raids, and building a maritime knowledge system that would later become essential to Atlantic commerce. Sugar cultivation on Atlantic islands such as Madeira and São Tomé offered a model of plantation organization long before the Caribbean reached its later scale. Labor coercion, monocrop production, export orientation, and violent discipline were all part of this world. The Atlantic slave trade did not appear from nowhere in the 17th century. Its roots lay in a long process of maritime expansion and commercial experimentation. The Spanish conquest of the Americas created another crucial precondition. Indigenous populations across parts of the Caribbean and mainland America suffered catastrophic demographic collapse from war, disease, forced labor, displacement, and colonial violence. Colonizers who saw people primarily as labor power searched urgently for new bodies to exploit. African captives were already being brought into Iberian worlds. Over time, as plantation regimes intensified, enslaved Africans became central to colonial labor systems from Brazil to the Caribbean and beyond. Different empires moved at different speeds. Different commodities shaped different labor demands. But the direction was clear. Atlantic wealth increasingly depended on coerced African labor. Sugar deserves special attention because it was one of the engines that made the system not just profitable but ravenous. Sugar plantations required enormous labor inputs for planting, cutting, transporting, crushing, boiling, refining, and shipping. The work was grueling, highly disciplined, and often lethal. Caribbean plantations in particular became notorious for harsh mortality. That meant enslaved populations in some colonies did not reproduce fast enough to sustain the labor force internally. Planters relied on continual imports. In this way, the plantation and the slave ship became parts of the same machine. One consumed people, the other replenished them. By the 17th century, the Atlantic system had become more clearly triangular in structure, even though actual trade routes were always more complicated than textbook diagrams imply. European goods such as textiles, metalware, firearms, alcohol, and manufactured items were exchanged on the African coast for captives. Captives were then shipped across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage. In the Americas, their labor produced sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, indigo, rice, and other commodities that were sent to Europe or to other Atlantic markets. Ships did not always complete a neat triangle. Some routes were direct, some were multi-stop. Some involved intercolonial trade, credit transfers, or re-export chains. But the broad system linked manufacturing, warfare, transport, and plantation production in ways that made each stage reinforce the others. How did a human being become cargo in this system? Usually not in the way older popular images once suggested. European sailors did not commonly march hundreds of miles inland in Africa, round up villagers, and haul them directly to waiting ships. More often, captives entered the Atlantic trade through African political and military systems shaped by warfare, raiding, judicial enslavement, kidnapping, debt, and internal slave trading networks. Some captives were prisoners of war. Some were victims of raids specifically intensified by the demand for exportable human beings. Some were kidnapped during moments of instability. Some were sold by local authorities or merchants. Once the Atlantic demand expanded, violence itself could become economically generative. Wars created captives. Captives created trade goods. Trade goods strengthened armies and rulers. Stronger rulers and better-armed raiders could then create more captives. The system fed back into itself. This does not mean all African societies responded in the same way. Some states, such as Dahomey at certain periods, became heavily entangled in slaving economies and military campaigns that generated captives. Others sought to limit European influence, redirect trade, or insulate their communities. Coastal brokers, inland merchants, rulers, and military elites all operated under different pressures. The Atlantic trade distorted local politics over time. rewarding some kinds of militarization and making some regions more vulnerable to long cycles of insecurity. A system designed across the ocean could transform social life far inland. The journey from capture to embarkation could itself take weeks or months and was often deadly. Captives might be marched in coffles, tied together by ropes, forked sticks, or metal restraints, through unfamiliar territory toward the coast. They could be beaten, starved, exposed, or sexually abused. Families were broken. Languages were mixed. The disorientation was not accidental. It served control. By the time many captives reached the coast, they had already endured multiple sales and transfers. The Atlantic crossing was not the beginning of violence. It was one stage in a sequence of violence. At the coast, European forts and factories became nodes of concentration. Places such as Elmina, Ouida, Bonny, Cape Coast Castle, and many other ports or holding areas formed part of a geography of exchange. These were not simply European enclaves operating in isolation. They were negotiated spaces, often dependent on local rulers and middlemen, embedded in coastal politics, disease environments, and shifting commercial conditions. Captives could be held in barracoons, yards, dungeons, or temporary compounds while ships assembled cargo. Waiting itself could be lethal. Disease spread. Food was insufficient. Violence was common. For many captives, the coast was the place where uncertainty gave way to the terrifying realization that removal from Africa might be permanent. European merchants and captains did not see ships primarily as vessels of suffering. They saw them as investments. A slaving voyage required credit, outfitting, provisioning, crew recruitment, trade goods, and risk management. Investors expected returns. Ships had to be designed or modified to maximize the number of captives they could carry while preserving enough of them alive to make the voyage profitable. This commercial logic shaped every practical decision. How much water to carry? How many shackles? How much food? How many crew? How much space between decks? How long to remain on the coast acquiring captives before disease, cost, or market timing made departure urgent? Human beings were being handled within a matrix of yield, spoilage, mortality, and insurance. This is one reason the phrase "the system worked" is so horrifying. It worked because merchants learned to optimize inhumanity. Captains understood that dead captives represented financial loss, but so did carrying too much water or giving away too much deck space. They therefore had incentives to preserve life only up to the point that preservation aligned with profit. Crowding could reach appalling levels because more bodies often meant more revenue, even if mortality rose. Tight packing became infamous in the late 18th century, especially as abolitionists circulated diagrams showing human bodies arranged in impossible density. Those diagrams were powerful because they translated horror into measurable geometry. They revealed not chaos, but planning. The Middle Passage has become the best-known symbol of the Atlantic slave trade, and rightly so, but the voyage varied by time, route, ship, weather, and captain. Some crossings were shorter, some longer. Mortality differed. Conditions remained systematically cruel. Captives were held in chains, often in darkness, heat, filth, and vomiting proximity. Men were commonly shackled in pairs or groups. Women and children might be held differently, but that did not mean they were safe. Women were especially vulnerable to sexual violence from crew. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, smallpox, dehydration, respiratory illness, and infection could move through the hold with terrifying speed. Dead bodies might remain among the living until removal became possible. The smell, the heat, the noise, and the lack of control over one's own body formed a regime of terror. Captains and crews often forced captives on deck periodically, partly to preserve saleable health, partly to clean the hold, partly to compel exercise. Dancing on deck under coercion became one of the obscene rituals of the voyage. Movement extracted from chained bodies for the sake of preserving market value. Food was forced into mouths. Instruments of restraint were used on people too sick or despairing to eat. Suicide attempts occurred. Some captives resisted by refusing food, jumping overboard, or organizing revolt. The Middle Passage was never a voyage of passive suffering. It was a site of constant contest between domination and human refusal, even when refusal ended in death. Shipboard revolt haunted captains. Crews were often outnumbered, and the consequences of successful rebellion could be catastrophic for investors and officers. This fear shaped ship architecture and routine. Barricades, weapons placement, guard patterns, and the segregation of groups all reflected the ever-present possibility that captives might seize a moment of weakness. Some did. There were revolts at sea, on the coast, and in harbors. Some failed bloodily. Some partially succeeded. The possibility of revolt itself is important because it reminds us that enslaved people were never merely cargo, however much the system attempted to reduce them to that condition. Insurance reveals another cold layer of the system. In some cases, captives could be insured as property. Commercial law found ways to translate stolen lives into compensable value. The infamous Zong massacre of 1781 exposed this logic with unusual clarity. When the crew of the British slave ship Zong threw more than 100 enslaved Africans overboard, the owners later sought insurance compensation for the loss, treating the murdered as cargo sacrificed for commercial necessity. The legal proceedings that followed helped abolitionists expose the deep moral depravity of the trade, but they also revealed something structurally important. Atlantic commerce had integrated slavery so fully that the murder of enslaved people could be processed through ordinary financial reasoning. Arrival in the Americas did not end the system's violence. It shifted its form. Captives were sold in ports, auctions, private sales, or plantation transfers. Buyers examined bodies for age, strength, signs of disease, and reproductive potential. Families and shipboard relationships formed under terror could be broken immediately on landing. Names were replaced or transformed. Branding, registration, and legal classification followed. In some places, newly arrived captives underwent seasoning, a chilling term for the process by which they were forced to adapt to new labor regimes, disease environments, languages, and punishment systems. Mortality in the first years after arrival could be very high. Different American regions used enslaved labor differently. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil were among the most brutal. Tobacco and rice regimes had their own rhythms and hazards. Coffee later expanded demand further. Cotton, especially after the late 18th century and into the 19th in the United States, would become another engine of forced labor. The Atlantic slave trade cannot be understood apart from these commodity frontiers. The demand for labor was not abstract. It was tied to particular crops, landscapes, technologies, and global markets. This is why the majority of captives did not go to what became the United States. The Smithsonian emphasizes that most were transported to the Caribbean and South America, where plantation systems, especially sugar, demanded huge numbers of laborers. British North America and then the United States formed an important, but not numerically dominant part of the Atlantic traffic. National memory in the United States has often made the trade seem primarily an American story. It is more accurate to say the United States inherited and expanded one branch of a much larger Atlantic system whose center of gravity often lay elsewhere. The plantation was not merely a workplace. It was a regime of total social control. Work rhythms were set by overseers, crop cycles, and coercion. Punishment could be immediate, public, and spectacular. Enslaved people were denied legal personhood in crucial respects, though local laws varied. Their marriages, families, movement, religion, naming, property, and bodily autonomy were all constrained. Yet the plantation never fully achieved the total domination it sought. Enslaved people created kin networks, spiritual practices, strategies of survival, sabotage, flight, slowdowns, negotiation, and rebellion. Culture under slavery was not a gift of the system. It was a human achievement in defiance of the system. From the perspective of merchants and planters, however, the plantation was the endpoint that justified the entire chain. The trade at sea made sense because plantation output promised returns. The enslaved workforce cut cane, fed mills, tended boiling houses, cleared land, repaired buildings, drove animals, planted food for subsistence, and reproduced the labor force where regimes allowed or compelled family formation. Accounting books link the price paid for a captive to expected years of labor and commodity yield. Births, deaths, punishments, illnesses, and absences all entered systems of calculation. The bureaucratic record of slavery is one of its most disturbing features. It reveals how domination became managerial. The Atlantic slave trade therefore operated as part of an emerging capitalist world, not because capitalism invented slavery, but because commercial expansion, investment logic, and imperial competition gave slavery extraordinary reach and resilience. Sugar in a London teacup, tobacco in a European pipe, cotton in an industrial mill, and coffee in a port city were all tied, directly or indirectly, to enslaved labor. Consumers at great distance from plantations and slave ports often encountered the system only in its finished products. This distance helped sustain moral evasion. Wealth could be enjoyed without seeing the hold, the auction yard, the cane field, or the punishment ground. Ports on both sides of the Atlantic grew rich through these circuits. Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, Lisbon, Amsterdam, Bordeaux, and other European cities became deeply entangled in slaving commerce or in related industries. Shipbuilding, rope-making, metalworking, textile manufacturing, finance, marine insurance, dock labor, and warehousing all fed on the trade. In the Americas, ports such as Havana, Kingston, Charleston, Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, Bridgetown, and many more formed links between plantation zones and wider markets. To say the trade worked is to say that many urban economies learned how to incorporate it as normal business. This normality was built not only through commerce, but through law. Laws defined enslaved people as property or near property. Laws regulated sale, punishment, inheritance, and racial status. Laws protected creditors, investors, and owners. Laws criminalized escape and resistance. Even when legal regimes differed by empire and colony, the broad pattern was unmistakable. States did not merely tolerate the trade. They facilitated and profited from it. Customs duties, charters, monopolies, naval protection, and treaty arrangements all connected state power to slaving interests. Governments condemned piracy while underwriting illegal commerce and stolen lives. Empires sharpened competition. The Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, British, French, and other European powers fought for access to labor, territory, and markets. Slave trading rights could become diplomatic prizes. The Asiento, for example, gave particular powers rights to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America and became entangled in European diplomacy and war. Colonial conquests changed who controlled islands, plantations, and shipping routes. War could interrupt trade, but it could also redirect it, opening new opportunities for smugglers, private merchants, and rival empires. The Atlantic slave trade cannot be separated from the military and diplomatic contests of empire. It was one of the stakes over which empires maneuvered. African coastal politics were transformed by these pressures. European demand for captives and trade goods encouraged some rulers and merchant networks to reorganize warfare and diplomacy around access to the coast. Firearms could be exchanged for people, and the people taken in war could be exchanged for firearms. That cycle intensified militarization in some regions. Yet it is crucial not to flatten Africa into one response. Conditions on the Gold Coast differed from those in the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, Senegambia, or Southeastern Africa. Political systems, ecological conditions, and trade patterns varied. Some communities moved inland to escape raids. Some fortified settlements. Some rose enslaving power. Others suffered catastrophic destabilization. This destabilization left deep social scars. Communities were depopulated. Gender balances shifted in some places as men, women, and children were captured in different patterns depending on region and period. Agricultural systems could be disrupted. Political legitimacy could become tied more tightly to violence and captive taking. Trust eroded. Travelers and strangers could be regarded with heightened fear. Entire regions carried the memory of roads to the coast as roads of disappearance. When historians speak about the Atlantic trade, they are not only counting crossings. They are tracing the deformation of societies under long pressure from external demand and internal conflict. Even in places where rulers profited from selling captives, the trade's long-term consequences could be corrosive. Short-term wealth and access to imported goods did not necessarily create long-term stability. Coastal states rose and fell. European power shifted from dependence on African intermediaries towards stronger imperial aggression where conditions permitted. The same commerce that enriched some elites could leave broader populations more exposed. By the 19th century, when formal abolition began to spread, some African economies deeply entangled with the trade were forced into abrupt and painful reorientation, while European powers increasingly prepared the next phase of domination: direct colonial rule. If the plantation was the destination of many captives, the ship remained the most concentrated symbol of the trade because it compressed the system into a moving prison. The slave ship was at once warehouse, weapon, investment vehicle, and floating market preparation. It was designed around surveillance and forced immobility. Space was parceled according to assumptions about profit and control. Captains knew that disease threatened returns, yet reducing crowding meant sacrificing capacity. Crew members feared revolt, yet preserving enough strength among captives for sale was also desirable. Every practical problem generated morally monstrous calculations. The human cost of those calculations cannot be captured only by mortality statistics. The Middle Passage subjected people to sensory and emotional assault on a scale that is difficult to reconstruct. Darkness below deck, chains biting skin, air thick with excrement, fear, vomit, salt, and sickness. The creak of timbers. The knowledge that language itself may not connect you to the person beside you. The sight or sound of people dying, praying, singing, resisting, vomiting, grieving, or falling silent. Historians and descendants have worked hard to restore individuality to victims of a system that tried to reduce them to fungible units. That work matters because numbers alone can become another kind of abstraction. Yet numbers do matter when confronting scale. Britannica notes that between 10 million and 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic in this trade. It also notes that the largest volume moved during the 18th century, especially to sugar regions. The peak decade saw astonishing numbers of voyages and captives. This was not sporadic criminality. It was a major branch of Atlantic commerce, visible in port records, customs books, shipping logs, insurance documents, and plantation inventories. The paperwork of the trade is one of the reasons we can track its extent. The same bureaucratic precision that made the system possible now serves as evidence against its sanitization. Resistance, however, also survives in the record. Some captives refused food. Some broke restraints. Some coordinated attacks. Some jumped into the sea rather than endure enslavement. Some preserved names, songs, prayers, or fragments of language. Some forged new relationships on board that mattered later in the Americas. Women resisted both the trade and the sexual predation that often accompanied it. Men, women, and children interpreted each stage of the process through memory, religion, and whatever strategic possibilities remained. To say the system worked is not to say its victims were passive. It is to say the system was powerful enough to repeatedly crush, redirect, or commodify resistance without ever fully eliminating it. Once in the Americas, the seasoning process often combined physical acclimatization with forced cultural rupture. New arrivals had to survive new diseases, new foods, new labor rhythms, new legal orders, and new languages or creoles. Planters wanted laborers, but they also wanted subjects of domination. Punishment, renaming, surveillance, and ritual humiliation formed part of that process. Yet the desire of owners to erase prior identity was never complete. Enslaved Africans and their descendants built religions, musical forms, kinship systems, foodways, political solidarities, and styles of resistance from both remembered African inheritances and New World conditions. The Atlantic slave trade was therefore also a story about cultural creation under coercion. Different plantation zones shaped that creation differently. In some Caribbean colonies, brutal mortality and continual importation produced societies where African-born people remained a high proportion of the enslaved population for long periods. In parts of British North America, and especially the later United States, the enslaved population eventually grew more through natural increase, though that growth rested on a system of reproductive exploitation and domestic slave trading no less violent in structure. In Brazil and Spanish America, legal forms and social practices differed again. No single plantation model can explain the whole Atlantic world, but across them all, coercion, racial hierarchy, and extraction remained central. The Atlantic trade also reorganized time. Plantation labor was timed by bells, overseers, harvest cycles, boiling schedules, market deadlines, and ship departures. Seasonal patterns in Europe could shape violence in the Caribbean or Brazil. Credit might be extended against a future crop grown by people who had not yet been captured. A banker or merchant could anticipate returns from labor that would only exist if a raid succeeded thousands of miles away. That temporal extension is one of the most chilling aspects of the system. The trade did not only move bodies across space. It projected domination into the future through contracts, debts, and expectations. Children were never incidental to this story. Children were captured in Africa. Children died on ships. Children were sold in the Americas. Children were born into slavery. Children watched parents disappear into coffles, ships, or markets. Children were assigned labor, punished, renamed, and assessed as future value. The system's durability depended partly on how thoroughly it reached into generational life. In many Atlantic societies, slavery became inheritable through the mother, ensuring that the child of an enslaved woman entered the world already claimed by property law. Here the trade's logic extended beyond importation into reproduction itself. Religion both justified and challenged the Atlantic slave trade. Christian empires and merchants repeatedly found ways to reconcile slavery with faith, invoking hierarchy, conversion, paternalism, or scriptural precedent. Baptism did not necessarily free an enslaved person. In many colonies, religious instruction was permitted or encouraged precisely because it was thought compatible with labor discipline and obedience. Yet Christian belief could also furnish language for critique, especially among Quakers, evangelical reformers, and later abolitionists. Enslaved people themselves adopted, transformed, and reinterpreted Christianity in ways that could deepen dignity, sustain resistance, or reframe suffering in communal and prophetic terms. The same complexity applies to Enlightenment thought. The 18th century is often celebrated as an age of reason, rights, and liberty. It was also a century in which the Atlantic slave trade reached extraordinary intensity. Philosophers spoke of universal humanity while merchants insured enslaved people and governments taxed slave-produced goods. This contradiction is not incidental to modernity. It is part of its history. Wealth extracted from slavery flowed into societies that also generated many of the era's most influential languages of freedom. The Atlantic world learned to hold principle and profit in the same hand, even when the two were at war in logic. Abolition did not arise simply because moral truth became obvious. It emerged from a convergence of enslaved resistance, black testimony, religious activism, political shifts, changing economic arguments, warfare, and public campaigning. Some of the most powerful critiques of the trade came from those who had endured it. Olaudah Equiano's narrative, often cited in the late 18th century, gave readers in Britain a direct account of capture, transport, and enslavement that challenged sanitized abstractions. Abolitionists circulated ship diagrams, petitions, pamphlets, parliamentary evidence, and eyewitness testimony. They sought to make the hidden visible. They turned the system's own commercial order against it by exposing its mechanics to public scrutiny. The British abolition movement has received perhaps the most sustained attention because Britain became one of the first major slave-trading powers to outlaw the trade in 1807, after years of organizing and parliamentary struggle. But abolition was never only British, nor was British abolition purely altruistic. Enslaved revolts, especially the Haitian Revolution, transformed the politics of slavery across the Atlantic by demonstrating that enslaved people could destroy a slave regime and create a new state. Economic shifts, wartime pressures, and imperial rivalry also shaped decision-making. Still, organized activism mattered profoundly. The abolition of the trade in law required millions of people to be made aware, shocked, persuaded, and mobilized. Even after legal abolition in some empires, the trade did not simply stop. Smuggling continued. Illegal voyages persisted for decades, especially to places where plantation demand remained high, such as Brazil and Cuba. Enforcement was uneven. Corruption and false papers were common. Naval patrols could intercept some ships, but the profits remained powerful. Abolition in law and abolition in practice often diverged sharply. Moreover, ending the transatlantic trade did not end slavery itself. In many places, slavery continued long after importation was banned. The system changed shape, but coercive labor regimes endured. The domestic slave trade within the United States after 1808 demonstrates this clearly. Once the international importation of enslaved people into the United States was banned, slavery did not wither. Instead, an internal trade expanded, especially as cotton cultivation spread across the Deep South. Families were broken apart within the nation. People were sold from the Upper South to the cotton frontier. The Atlantic slave trade had helped build the racial and legal architecture that made this possible. Even when one branch of the system closed, another intensified. Abolitionists also had to confront the fact that many people who hated the slave trade did not necessarily support racial equality or immediate emancipation. Some wanted a cleaner empire or nation without the trade while still profiting from slavery already rooted in colonial soil. Some opposed the horrors of the Middle Passage but accepted bondage where it was established. Some feared slave revolts more than they mourned enslaved suffering. The politics of abolition were therefore layered and compromised. Ending the trade did not automatically create justice. It changed one mechanism of injustice within a much larger order. The long 19th century would reveal this painfully. Even as legal slave trading declined in the Atlantic, imperial labor systems, debt bondage, indenture, colonial forced labor, and racial hierarchy continued in new forms. Modernity did not simply move from slavery to freedom in a neat progression. It reconfigured coercion. That is one reason UNESCO's modern remembrance work insists on linking the slave trade to present-day racism and inequality. The Atlantic trade is not only a completed historical event, it is part of the architecture of the modern world. The legacies of the Atlantic slave trade can be traced in demography, language, religion, cuisine, music, political thought, wealth distribution, architecture, law, and racial ideology. Entire populations in the Americas descend from people transported through this system. Entire ports, banks, and urban fortunes in Europe were shaped by it. Plantation landscapes in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the U.S. South bear its imprint physically. Family histories, surnames, oral traditions, and burial grounds carry it intimately. Museums, memorials, and sites of conscience now struggle with how to represent an event so vast that no single building or exhibit can contain it. Memory has never been neutral here. For a long time, many states, cities, and institutions minimized their entanglement. Ports celebrated maritime greatness without mentioning slave voyages. Families celebrated mercantile success without naming its source. Plantation houses were preserved as architecture while the people who built and worked them remained marginal to the story. Schoolbooks narrowed the trade into a few moral paragraphs detached from economics and empire. This selective remembering was itself part of the legacy. Silence protected beneficiaries. It did not heal the descendants of the harmed. In recent decades, more institutions have been forced to reckon publicly with this past. UNESCO's Routes of Enslaved Peoples program works to preserve memory sites and link the history of slavery and the slave trade to contemporary struggles against racism. Museums in Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas now treat the trade not as a footnote, but as a central structuring force in modern history. Archaeological projects, such as work on slave shipwrecks, add material depth to the documentary record. The point is not only to recover facts, it is to restore proportion. The Atlantic slave trade was not an unfortunate side story to modern development. It was one of its engines. One of the hardest truths to confront is that the system succeeded partly because it distributed responsibility so widely. A plantation owner could blame the trader. A trader could blame African suppliers. A ship captain could blame investors and markets. Consumers could claim distance from production. Governments could speak of national prosperity. Clergy could speak of souls. Lawyers could speak of property. Each node could shift blame along the chain. This diffusion made the trade harder to confront morally because no single point exhausted the crime. Yet the chain itself was the crime. The system worked because many people could tell themselves that what happened elsewhere was not finally their burden. That is why studying the mechanics matters. We have to know how credit financed voyages, how goods were selected for African markets, how captives were marched and held, how ships were fitted, how insurance calculated risk, how sale books were kept, how plantation labor was scheduled, how laws coded race, how empires taxed goods, and how public opinion was managed. Moral outrage without structural understanding leaves too much intact. The Atlantic slave trade was not sustained only by bad men. It was sustained by institutions that rewarded participation and normalized distance from suffering. And yet the story cannot end with structure alone. Systems are real, but so are people. A mother trying to hold on to a child as a coffle moves. A man refusing food on a ship. A woman preserving a song or prayer across language boundaries. A crewman disgusted but complicit. A merchant enjoying profits without seeing the hold. A planter counting deaths as business loss. A child in a European port drinking sweetened tea while slavery remains invisible in the cup. A preacher wondering whether the gospel can coexist with the auction block. A revolutionary in Saint-Domingue deciding that words about liberty will be taken literally at last. History lives in these human scales even when systems seem too large to grasp. The Atlantic slave trade also forces a harder question about modern civilization itself. What kinds of wealth, order, and refinement become possible when entire populations are denied humanity so that their labor can be converted into capital? Beautiful port cities, commercial sophistication, parliamentary eloquence, and consumer abundance all look different when seen through this question. The trade does not sit outside the history of modern states. It sits inside them. To study it seriously is to study how moral catastrophe can coexist with administrative competence and cultural achievement. That coexistence is one reason the subject remains uncomfortable. People prefer villains who look unlike themselves. The Atlantic slave trade reveals something worse. Ordinary commercial society, under imperial conditions, can integrate extraordinary violence without ceasing to think of itself as civilized. Merchants wrote letters, balanced accounts, and attended church. Investors diversified portfolios. Legislators debated regulation. Families built dynasties. Ships were insured. Warehouses were inventoried. The horror was not only that cruelty happened. It was that cruelty became infrastructural. This is also why the trade continues to matter in public arguments about reparations, memory, institutional responsibility, and racial inequality. The system's profits did not evaporate. Some were consumed. Some were reinvested. Some became land, buildings, universities, banks, and intergenerational wealth. The losses borne by the enslaved were not only personal or bodily. They were civilizational. Kinship rupture, stolen labor, stolen futures, suppressed sovereignty, and the long afterlife of racist systems built to justify all of it. The past remains politically active because the structures it helped create remain unevenly distributed in the present. If we strip away euphemism, the Atlantic slave trade was a machine for converting people into capital. But if we stop there, we still miss something essential. It was also a machine that failed to do what it most wanted: erase the humanity of the people it consumed. Enslaved Africans and their descendants remade the Atlantic world culturally, politically, spiritually, and demographically, even under conditions designed to crush them. Music, religion, language, cuisine, agricultural knowledge, resistance traditions, family forms, and political visions all emerged from people the system treated as cargo or property. The history of the trade is therefore not only a history of victimization. It is also a history of survival, adaptation, and counter-creation under impossible conditions. That survival should never be romanticized. To say that enslaved people created enduring cultures is not to soften what was done to them. It is to refuse the second violence of allowing the system's categories to define them completely. The same people who were marched in chains, sold at auctions, and worked under the lash were also parents, healers, metalworkers, farmers, strategists, linguists, rebels, believers, musicians, and builders of new worlds. Their descendants transformed the Americas and, through the Atlantic, transformed the globe. The system worked at enormous cost. It did not achieve total spiritual victory. The ports of departure and arrival tell this story physically. On the African coast, places of embarkation are also places of mourning and memory. In the Americas, landing points and auction sites are places where one social death often became the beginning of another regime of life under coercion. Plantation landscapes, burial grounds, maroon communities, rebel sites, and later abolitionist centers form part of one vast geography of slavery and resistance. UNESCO's memory work matters precisely because the trade was spatial as much as temporal. It moved through roads, rivers, forts, harbors, islands, and plantations. To remember it honestly is to map it. Even language carries the system's history. Words like cargo, lot, piece, stock, prime, seasoned, and sound entered sales culture to classify human beings for market purposes. Plantation ledgers and shipping manifests adopted commercial vocabularies that shrank persons into units. At the same time, names, songs, proverbs, and ritual languages survived or were remade against that reduction. The Atlantic world became linguistically hybrid because people carried memory and speech even when documents denied them personhood. That tension between bureaucratic language and human expression remains one of the key interpretive challenges of the history. The system also changed how Europe thought about Africa. Long before modern anthropology and colonial science, the demands of the Atlantic trade encouraged forms of racial simplification that made African societies easier to exploit conceptually as well as commercially. Diversity was collapsed into category. Political complexity was ignored or instrumentalized. Human difference was moralized into hierarchy. This intellectual violence served economic need. If millions were to be traded, someone had to explain why that trade did not violate the conscience of Christian and increasingly enlightened societies. Racism developed not only as prejudice, but as infrastructure of justification. That infrastructure outlived the legal trade. Emancipation did not erase the ideas that had been used to sustain slavery. Instead, those ideas continued to shape policing, citizenship, labor control, education, housing, and cultural representation across the Atlantic world. The formal end of one trade did not dissolve the social order it had helped build. This is why commemoration without structural analysis can feel hollow to descendants and scholars alike. The question is not only what happened, but what kept happening because it had happened. When people ask how the Atlantic slave trade worked, they often want a chain of events: capture, coast, ship, sale, plantation. That chain is correct, but incomplete. The fuller answer is that the trade worked because many different worlds were synchronized around its profitability. African conflicts and negotiations, European credit and manufacturing, American plantation demand, imperial law, maritime technology, consumer appetite, and racial ideology all aligned enough, often enough, to sustain centuries of extraction. The trade did not work because it was efficient in every moment. It worked because failures at one point could be absorbed by profits elsewhere. Captives died, but others were taken. Ships were lost, but insurance spread risk. Colonies changed hands, but planters still needed labor. Laws shifted, but smuggling adapted. A resilient atrocity is one that many institutions know how to keep repairing. And yet the trade also generated its own destroyers. Every revolt, every maroon settlement, every abolitionist pamphlet, every courtroom scandal, every testimony from the enslaved, every naval interception, every parliamentary inquiry, every rebellion in the plantations, and every contradiction between liberty and slavery widened the moral and political pressure on the system. The Haitian Revolution in particular shattered assumptions about permanent white mastery in the plantation world. It proved that the enslaved were not only resisting within the system, but capable of destroying it and founding power of their own. After that, Atlantic slavery could never again be imagined as permanently secure in the same way. Still, abolition came slowly, unevenly, and often with compensations paid to owners rather than to the enslaved. This fact alone should caution us against narratives of easy moral progress. States that had profited enormously from slavery often ended the trade or slavery itself in ways designed to protect property, social order, and elite interests. The enslaved and their descendants were expected to rebuild lives from devastation with little redress. The afterlife of slavery was built into abolition itself. So what, finally, was the Atlantic slave trade? It was a transport system, a labor system, a legal system, a financial system, an imperial system, and a racial system. It was a series of roads to the coast, a line of forts, a design for ships, a structure of credit, an auction block, a plantation bell, a book of accounts, a market of commodities, a language of dehumanization, and a long struggle of resistance against all of it. It was not one thing. That is why it lasted so long. Systems that can attach themselves to many institutions are difficult to uproot. And what did it do? It helped create the modern Atlantic world. It moved millions by force. It enriched empires. It depopulated and destabilized regions. It made plantations into engines of commodity production. It fed consumption far from scenes of violence. It hardened racial ideologies that still damage the present. It created diasporas of extraordinary cultural power under catastrophic conditions. It left ports, nations, and families marked by profit on one side and loss on the other. It changed what the modern world is. If there is one final lesson in studying how the system worked, it is that evil at scale rarely survives on open sadism alone. It survives by becoming ordinary to enough people at enough distances. It survives when paperwork is neat, when profits are real, when language is softened, when suffering is outsourced, when law is accommodating, and when memory is selective. The Atlantic slave trade endured because whole societies learned how to live beside it, benefit from it, justify it, and only partially see it. The work of history is to undo that partial vision. The ships are gone now. Many of the ledgers remain. The ports remain. The sugar islands remain. The burial grounds remain. The names, silences, songs, and descendants remain. The trade is over. Its world is not. And that is why understanding how it worked is not only an exercise in past description. It is part of understanding how the modern world learned to organize profit, race, law, and violence into a system, and how those who were meant to disappear instead left enduring claims on history that the system could never finally erase. To see the system at its height, imagine the Atlantic in the 18th century not as open water, but as a patterned route map of human extraction. Ships left Liverpool or Bristol loaded with textiles, guns, metal bars, alcohol, tools, beads, and manufactured where selected not randomly, but according to coastal markets and prior experience. They reached ports on the African coast after weeks at sea and entered a waiting game. Captains bargained with local brokers, rulers, or merchants. Disease threatened European crews in the tropics. Captive supply depended on wars, inland caravans, seasonal conditions, and political negotiations beyond the captain's control. Time on the coast cost money. The longer a ship remained, the greater the danger of mortality, desertion, corruption, or spoilage. Yet leaving too early meant sailing underloaded and reducing profit. So the coast itself became a zone of suspended violence and impatient calculation. A captain's journal from such a voyage might discuss weather, death, trade values, discipline, and route timing in the same cool sequence. That emotional flattening was part of the system's functioning. Men trained themselves to think administratively about suffering because administration made the voyage legible to owners and insurers at home. Crew hierarchy reinforced this. Captains answered to investors. Officers answered to captains. Sailors answered to officers. Violence against captives often existed alongside violence against crew, whose labor conditions could also be brutal, though never equivalent to enslavement. Sailors were beaten, underfed, disease-ridden, and expendable in the eyes of owners. This harsh maritime culture could make cruelty toward captives seem like an extension of shipboard discipline, even as the distinction between exploited labor and commodified human property remained absolute. On the African side of the trade, inland geography mattered enormously. Captives from the interior did not emerge magically at the shoreline. They moved along river systems, caravan routes, and chains of sail that could involve multiple languages and jurisdictions. Some were marched from far inland in West Central Africa or the interior of the Bight regions. Others came from conflicts nearer the coast. Along the way, they could be renamed, regrouped, inspected, and reclassified. Children might be separated from parents. Men and women could be divided according to anticipated market demand. The coast concentrated these people into a temporary Atlantic order before the ship translated them into oceanic property. We should be careful with one common simplification. European forts on the coast were not always giant prisons stuffed with captives waiting on behalf of one power. Some functioned that way at certain moments, but the commercial reality could also be more diffuse, with barracoons, temporary compounds, beach embarkations, local brokers' yards, and varied arrangements depending on region and period. The central point is not the architecture of every port but the pattern. The coast became a conversion zone where inland violence was turned into oceanic sail. There were also regional differences in who dominated which routes. Portuguese and Brazilian traders played particularly large roles in West Central African traffic, especially connected to Angola and Brazil. British merchants dominated vast portions of the 18th century trade, especially at its peak. French traders were deeply involved in supplying Saint-Domingue and other colonies. Dutch, Spanish, Danish, and smaller-scale operators all mattered in different periods. No single empire owned the Atlantic trade completely. Its scale came partly from the fact that multiple empires and merchant communities participated, competed, and adapted. The destinations mattered as much as the departures. Saint-Domingue, before the Haitian Revolution, was one of the richest colonies in the world, built on plantation slavery so intense that it consumed life at extraordinary rates. Jamaica, Barbados, Cuba, Brazil, and other plantation zones each demanded labor in distinct but connected ways. Rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia relied not only on African labor, but on African agricultural knowledge. Sugar mills and coffee estates in the Caribbean and Brazil had different rhythms from mainland tobacco or later cotton regions, yet all drew from the same larger logic: the transformation of black life into export wealth. Consider the sugar colony as a machine of appetite. Cane had to be planted, weeded, cut at the right moment, carried fast to the mill, crushed, boiled, clarified, and reduced before spoilage destroyed value. The work was seasonal in some respects, but relentless in its demand for disciplined energy. Night labor in boiling houses could be especially dangerous. Heat, sharp tools, moving rollers, and exhaustion created constant hazards. The plantation therefore required not only field laborers but artisans, drivers, carpenters, coopers, sugar boilers, domestics, stock tenders, and watchmen. Enslaved labor permeated the entire operation. The plantation was not one field. It was a coerced social world. In colonies where the enslaved vastly outnumbered whites, fear structured everyday life. Planters feared rebellion, poison, fire, sabotage, and alliance among the enslaved. Legal codes responded with surveillance, curfews, severe punishments, and restrictions on movement, assembly, literacy, and weapon access. Yet the more planters feared the enslaved, the more they revealed a truth they preferred not to say plainly. Their wealth rested on the labor of people who hated their condition and outnumbered them in many districts. Slave societies were not stable because they were peaceful. They were stable when they were because they mobilized terror, legal force, military response, and social division more effectively than the enslaved could organize open overthrow, until, in some places, they no longer could. The Haitian Revolution proved this in the most dramatic way. Saint-Domingue had been a jewel of the French Empire, producing astonishing quantities of sugar and coffee through enslaved labor. But beginning in 1791, revolution from below shattered the assumption that the plantation order was permanent. Enslaved people rose, fought, negotiated, split, aligned, and fought again in a conflict entwined with the French Revolution, imperial warfare, and the global politics of emancipation. The eventual emergence of Haiti as an independent black republic in 1804 terrified slaveholding societies across the Atlantic and electrified abolitionists and the enslaved. It forced even defenders of slavery to confront the fact that the trade's human cargo were political actors capable of remaking the world. The Haitian case also illuminates the relationship between the Atlantic trade and modern political ideals. France had proclaimed rights of man, while sustaining one of the wealthiest slave colonies in the world. The enslaved in Saint-Domingue took the language of rights, liberty, and sovereignty with a seriousness the imperial center had not intended for them. In doing so, they exposed the Atlantic world's central contradiction more clearly than perhaps any other event. The trade had helped make Atlantic modernity rich. Atlantic modernity had also generated languages that could be turned against the trade and the plantation. British abolitionism after 1807 often cast itself as humanitarian progress, but Britain's role before abolition had been central to the system's expansion. Liverpool in particular became a major slave trading port whose wealth, employment, and political influence were intertwined with slaving voyages and their downstream commerce. Insurance markets, credit mechanisms, and manufacturing interests all benefited. This makes British abolition historically important, but also morally complex. The same state and commercial society that had profited enormously from the trade later policed it at sea. Imperial self-congratulation could obscure imperial complicity. Naval suppression after abolition produced another layer of Atlantic violence. Ships pursued suspected slavers. Captives on intercepted vessels might be liberated into new forms of apprenticeship, military labor, or colonial control rather than full freedom. Courts adjudicated legality. Smugglers adapted flags and paperwork. In some cases, captains of illegal slavers packed people even more tightly than before because speed and secrecy mattered. Abolition altered incentives, but did not make the Atlantic safe for the vulnerable overnight. The United States offers its own revealing pattern. Fewer enslaved Africans were imported directly there than to the Caribbean or Brazil, yet slavery became central to national development. The 1808 constitutional window for ending the international trade came and went, but plantation slavery surged westward internally. Cotton became the great engine. Domestic sales moved hundreds of thousands from the Upper South to new territories. The language of liberty in the Republic coexisted with one of the most expansive slave societies of the 19th century. That coexistence cannot be separated from the Atlantic trade that had already racialized property and normalized hereditary bondage. There is another dimension to how the system worked that deserves attention: information. Merchants, captains, and investors depended on flows of market intelligence. Which coast was yielding captives? Which colonies had labor shortages? What sugar prices looked like? Whether war threatened a route? What diseases were spreading in a port? What rival traders were offering for captives? This informational world was not as fast as modern markets, but it was disciplined enough to coordinate enormous violence. Letters, logs, newspapers, insurers' notices, and port gossip all helped capital chase opportunity. The trade was a knowledge system as much as a shipping system. African knowledge mattered too, though in very different ways. Brokers knew inland conditions. Rulers knew rivalries and opportunities. Interpreters bridged languages. Pilots knew dangerous waters and bars at river mouths. Captains depended on local expertise, even while imagining themselves masters of the transaction. This dependence is one reason the trade was not simply European imposition. It was a negotiated and violent system whose terms changed according to regional politics. Again, this complicates responsibility without dissolving it. The Atlantic slave trade was built from asymmetrical interdependence. European shipping and Atlantic markets met African political economies under conditions increasingly warped by external demand for captives. The category of cargo also changed over time. Traders and buyers categorized captives by age, sex, physical appearance, skills were discernible, and presumed marketability. This sorting was never neutral. It reflected labor demands and racist assumptions. Men might be preferred for certain field labor regimes, women for others, children for still others. Skilled laborers could attract special attention, though many captives' prior knowledge was invisible to buyers. The market thus imposed a new classification system on people whose own social identities were richer, more specific, and violently ignored. Once sold, the process of social death was never complete. This point, argued powerfully by many historians, matters because the trade and slavery sought to strip people of kin, status, homeland, legal personhood, and future autonomy. Yet enslaved people recreated forms of family and community under extreme constraint. Naming practices, fictive kinship, marriage, caregiving, burial, and spiritual life all represented ways of refusing total reduction to property. Resistance was not only revolt. It could be persistence in being human where the system insisted on accounting value alone. Open rebellion, however, remained a constant possibility. Across the Americas there were uprisings large and small, conspiracies, maroon wars, poisonings, arson, sabotage, and slow forms of labor refusal. The Atlantic system responded with terrifying violence. Executions, mutilation, collective punishment, expanded surveillance. Yet the need for such force proved the fragility of the order beneath its apparent wealth. A system that must continually terrorize its workers to remain productive is not secure. It is afraid. Fear also shaped white social life. Planter culture often celebrated mastery, leisure, refinement, and patriarchal order, but behind these displays lay chronic anxiety. Night patrols, militia musters, code restrictions, and rumors of revolt all indicated deep awareness that slave society rested on coercive imbalance. The Atlantic trade did not only enrich white societies, it distorted them psychologically and politically. It taught generations to defend freedom for some by normalizing domination over others. That contradiction would have lasting consequences for republicanism, citizenship, and democracy across the Atlantic world. The intellectual defense of the trade and slavery became more elaborate as criticism intensified. Pro-slavery thinkers argued that Africans were suited for labor in tropical climates, that enslavement introduced civilization or Christianity, that plantation wealth benefited all, that sudden emancipation would bring chaos, or that hierarchy was natural. These arguments were not peripheral propaganda. They were part of the machinery. Every large system of exploitation develops a language to excuse itself. In the Atlantic case, that language eventually hardened into modern racism with scientific pretensions. Craniology, pseudobiology, and racial ranking in the 19th century helped rationalize a world already built on older forms of Christianized and commercial hierarchy. Abolitionists, free black thinkers, formerly enslaved writers, and radical reformers fought this language on many fronts. They did so not only by appealing to sympathy, but by exposing contradiction. How could a Christian nation defend the whip? How could a constitutional republic hold millions in bondage? How could commerce call itself civilized while packing chained people into holds? How could an enlightened age rely on hereditary degradation? These questions mattered because they did not arise outside the Atlantic system. They arose from within societies that had to reckon with their own dependence on coercion. The end of the transatlantic trade in law also shifted struggles onto memory and history. Once a trade is abolished, former trading powers can attempt to narrate themselves as humane reformers rather than long-time beneficiaries. Museums may focus on abolition heroes more than on merchant complicity. National stories may highlight legal milestones while muting plantation violence. In some places, descendants of traders kept houses, titles, or institutions built on slave profits while public acknowledgement lagged for generations. The afterlife of the trade, therefore, includes a battle over narrative. Who is remembered as actor? Who is remembered as victim? Who is forgotten? Who gets turned into moral decoration for a nation's self-image? This is why projects like UNESCO's Routes of Enslaved Peoples and the Smithsonian's exhibitions matter so much. They insist that memory be transnational. No single country can tell this story honestly on its own because the system crossed oceans, empires, and legal regimes. To remember only the ship and not the plantation is inadequate. To remember only the plantation and not the coast is inadequate. To remember only the coast and not the consumer markets is inadequate. The Atlantic slave trade was a chain, and memory must follow the chain. Archaeology adds a different kind of moral pressure because objects persist where euphemism fails. Shackles, ballast, ship timbers, beads, ceramics, branding irons, plantation tools, grave sites, fort walls, and cargo spaces can make the past disturbingly tangible. The Slave Wrecks Project and related work humanized the trade by grounding it in material evidence linked to individual voyages and places. A sunken ship is not just a wreck. It is a submerged crime scene in a global system of trafficking. Material remains can restore weight to histories that comfortable narratives have tried to float away. And then there is reparative argument. Once a society admits that millions were stolen, worked, terrorized, and denied the fruits of their own labor in ways that enriched states and institutions, the question of repair follows almost automatically. What is owed, by whom, to whom, and in what form? Money, land, apology, institutional reform, memorialization, curriculum, legal redress, health investment, community restoration. Different answers exist, and disagreement is intense. But the very intensity of that disagreement shows that the Atlantic slave trade is not merely archived. It is still politically alive. To ask how the system worked is therefore also to ask why it lasted so long despite resistance, critique, and obvious moral horror. One answer is simple: it was profitable. Another is deeper: it was embedded. It touched enough interests, in enough places, across enough generations, that dismantling it required more than moral clarity. It required political struggle, war, rebellion, changing economic structures, transnational activism, and the testimony of those whom the system had tried hardest to silence. Even then, what was dismantled was incomplete. Slavery's legal form ended in different places at different times, but racial order, economic inequality, and coerced labor's afterlives persisted. The Atlantic slave trade also shaped ideas of history itself. It produced archives full of absences because the most powerful records were often written by captains, merchants, planters, clerks, and states. Historians have had to reconstruct enslaved experience from hostile documents, court records, ship logs, plantation accounts, oral histories, archaeology, and rare first-person narratives. That methodological challenge is part of the story. The system not only exploited people, it often documented them in ways meant to deny subjectivity. Writing the history of the trade thus becomes, in part, an act of recovering personhood from records built to erase it. Yet, even these archives betray more humanity than their creators intended. A note about illness, a mention of resistance, a change in provisioning after unrest, a recorded death, a legal claim after a massacre, a baptism, a runaway notice, a sale with family separations implied. Each fragment points beyond the account book to lives that cannot be fully contained by the categories imposed on them. The historian's task is not to pretend that the archive is whole. It is to read against the grain of a system that recorded value while disfiguring meaning. If we return one last time to the ships, we can see why they remain such powerful symbols. A ship connects worlds. It turns distant suffering into local wealth and distant wealth into local appetite. It is technology made mobile. In the Atlantic slave trade, the ship became a machine for carrying social death, but also a place where identities were violently rearranged and where resistance, mourning, and memory began taking new forms. The ship was not the whole system, but it dramatized the system's essence. Movement organized for profit regardless of the human ruin required. By the 19th century, as formal abolition spread and empires adjusted, some defenders of slavery argued that the trade had been a regrettable excess, while plantation slavery itself could be humane or paternal. This argument was false not only morally but historically. The plantation world had been built by the trade, shaped by the trade, and taught by the trade how to think of black life as extractable wealth. You could not cleanly separate the field from the hold, the whip from the ledger, or the commodity from the captive. The whole order was connected. That connection reached into culture as well as economics. Atlantic music, religion, language, food, and political thought bear the marks of forced migration and cultural recomposition. From Afro-Brazilian religion to Caribbean creoles, from Black church traditions in North America to musical lineages that would eventually reshape global culture, the descendants of the enslaved transformed the world that had been built on their exploitation. The system worked. It still did not get the last word. So how should we finally understand the Atlantic slave trade? Not as a tragic side effect of empire, and not as a pre-modern barbarism that modernity later corrected. It was one of the constitutive processes of the modern Atlantic world. It linked Africa, Europe, and the Americas in a system of extraction that shaped capitalism, state power, race, and memory. It built fortunes, destroyed families, enriched ports, depopulated regions, generated cultures, and normalized legal and intellectual structures whose damage has not vanished. If we remove the trade from the story of modernity, modernity becomes false. This is why the subject still unsettles. It asks modern societies to look at admired achievements, commercial sophistication, constitutional development, urban wealth, cultural refinement, global trade, and ask what was required to make them possible. It asks us to see that progress can be built on cages. It asks us to understand that rational systems are not morally safe simply because they are rational. It asks us to recognize that brutality organized through law, contracts, and shipping manifests may be more enduring than brutality expressed only as open savagery. The Atlantic slave trade worked because enough people could imagine themselves decent while participating in or benefiting from indecency. That is the lesson with the longest reach. The problem was not only monsters. It was ordinary people inhabiting institutions that translated cruelty into routine. The captains who calculated water, the merchants who accepted invoices, the insurers who priced risk, the clerks who listed names or erased them, the buyers who inspected teeth and limbs, the legislators who protected property, the consumers who preferred sweetness without asking where the labor came from. The silence of many hands made the system durable. And yet the history also contains a counter-lesson. Systems that appear overwhelming can still be opposed from many positions at once. The enslaved resisted by revolt, escape, survival, sabotage, family-making, and memory. Black writers and activists exposed the trade in print. Religious dissenters challenged it in moral language. Radicals connected it to wider struggles over rights and humanity. Revolutions frightened planters and inspired the oppressed. Legislators were pressured. Navies were forced to act. Museums now preserve what earlier societies wished to forget. There is no easy consolation in this. But there is a truth. The trade endured for centuries, and still it did not become morally final. If you stand today at a former slave fort, or in a sugar plantation ruin, or at a port enriched by the trade, the temptation is to imagine the system as gone because the buildings are quiet. But the quiet can mislead. The Atlantic slave trade was not only an event, it was an architecture. Some of its visible institutions have fallen. Many of its effects remain embedded in wealth, race, geography, memory, and public silence. To study how the system worked is to study how violence can be made infrastructural and how its afterlives can survive long after the chains are no longer forged. That is why this story belongs not only to the past, but to the present. It belongs wherever people ask why some regions are rich and others poor, why race carries the meanings it does, why some family histories begin in rupture, why certain ports and plantations are now places of mourning, why archives are full of ledgered humanity, why abolition required so much struggle, and why justice delayed can echo through centuries. The trade's victims were meant to be reduced to labor and then forgotten. Instead, they and their descendants remain among the central makers of the Atlantic world's history and culture. The system worked. That is the terrible fact. It worked across centuries, oceans, languages, and empires. It worked by adapting. It worked by dividing responsibility. It worked by turning distance into moral numbness and profit into justification. But the deeper fact is that those it tried to consume did not disappear into the accounts. They remain in the music, food, speech, religion, politics, memory, and demands for justice that continue to shape the modern world. So when we ask how the Atlantic slave trade worked, the answer is not only that ships sailed, markets functioned, and plantations demanded labor. The answer is that modern societies learned how to coordinate human theft at scale and call it commerce. And if we ask what it left behind, the answer is not only graves, ruins, and archives. It left behind the world we still inhabit and a moral reckoning that is not finished. There is one more misconception worth confronting. The Atlantic slave trade is sometimes described as if it were primarily a labor migration under terrible conditions, a distorted labor market rather than a system of total dispossession. That language is far too weak. Migration suggests agency. The enslaved were not migrating for opportunity. They were being stolen. Labor suggests a contract, however unequal. They were not entering contracts. They were being turned into property. Even the phrase slave trade can sometimes sound as if the object of exchange were a stable category called slaves, rather than people who were captured and then made into slaves through violence and law. The process mattered. Human beings were not found as commodities. They were manufactured as commodities by force. That distinction is not semantic. It changes how we interpret every stage of the system. If we begin with the category slave, we risk inheriting the trader's perspective. If we begin with people made enslaved, we keep the violence visible. The Atlantic trade depended on a conversion process. Free or socially situated human beings were captured, sold, renamed, chained, shipped, and legally reclassified until their prior status became difficult to recover. Historical accuracy requires that we remember the process as well as the product. This matters especially when we think about African origins. The people driven to the coast came from societies with names, kinship systems, religious beliefs, crafts, agricultural knowledge, languages, and political worlds of their own. Many had never seen the ocean. Some had lived under rulers who themselves were entangled in regional slave systems. Others had not. Some came from urban settings, others from villages or pastoral regions. The Atlantic trade collapsed this diversity into saleable categories. Recovery work by historians, genealogists, linguists, and archaeologists has tried to reconstruct these origins where possible, but the system was designed to blur them. In that blurring lay power. The same need for recovery applies to labor knowledge. Enslaved Africans did not arrive in the Americas as blank bodies awaiting discipline. Many brought skills that were crucial to colonial economies. Rice cultivation in South Carolina and Georgia drew on West African expertise. Metalworking, boat building, animal handling, herbal knowledge, carpentry, and textile practices also mattered in different regions. Planters often wanted bodies, but they also benefited from capacities they scarcely acknowledged as expertise. The system worked not only by extracting brute force, but by appropriating intelligence, memory, and craft. There is also the question of scale over time. The trade changed. Early Atlantic slavery did not look exactly like the 18th century peak. Routes shifted. Imperial control shifted. The relative importance of regions changed. The legal and ideological justifications hardened. Some historians emphasize the 17th century as the decisive period when plantation slavery and racial law became deeply institutionalized in the English Atlantic. Others emphasize longer continuities from Iberian worlds. Both perspectives matter. What should remain clear is that the mature system was not inevitable from the start. It was built decision by decision, law by law, ship by ship, war by war, market by market. That built quality has ethical importance. Systems that are built can be unbuilt. But unbuilding takes force, conflict, and sustained effort, especially once large numbers of people benefit from the arrangement. The Atlantic slave trade lasted so long not because no one saw its horror, but because too many interests preferred its continuation. Enslaved people saw it. Some sailors saw it. Some clergy saw it. Some legislators saw it. Some consumers saw enough of it to feel unease. Yet unease is not abolition. Institutions changed only when moral pressure, rebellion, political opportunity, and strategic interest aligned strongly enough to overcome inertia and profit. If we widen our view one last time, the Atlantic slave trade can be understood as part of a larger history of coerced labor in the making of the modern world. Indigenous enslavement, convict transportation, indentured labor, and later colonial labor coercion all formed adjacent or overlapping histories. But the Atlantic trade stands out because of its scale, its duration, its oceanic reach, and the racial order it helped consolidate. It made blackness globally legible in a new and devastating way. That fact shaped everything from law to daily prejudice to national identity. And this is where the story returns, finally, to recognition. The trade was designed to make millions of people disappear into labor, accountancy, and death. Yet they remained central to the world that followed. Not as background, not as tragic shadows, but as makers of Atlantic history. Their forced labor built wealth they were denied. Their descendants built cultures no system could fully control. Their resistance bent politics toward abolition. Their memory now forces institutions, nations, and publics to look again at what modernity cost. The Atlantic slave trade worked. It also failed in one thing it most desired: the total erasure of the people it tried to turn into movable property.